If you're a creator and you're looking for a laptop that packs absolutely amazing performance, then this Lenovo gaming laptop is the one to beat. I mean, for the price and performance, this is insane what you're getting. I mean, the performance, just a little sneak peek before we even get into the video. If you built anything from the 11th gen, like you get absolutely maxed out 11th gen Intel with the best GPU available, as much RAM as you can, then this laptop is still gonna beat you in most of the benchmarks and most of the creative applications. Wow. I mean, not just beating it by performance, but also with the price. Don't believe me? Well, let's have a look.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out Whokeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20 to get a 30% off. Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20 to get a 30% off. Check out whokeys.com in the video description below.
I don't do a lot of like gaming laptop reviews, and if we're doing it, we're going to be looking at this at like from the creative perspective. But I did ask Jared and Benji Kaiser like what's like a good laptop to review, and they did say that this is like one of the most popular laptops from last year. But now with the Gen 7, you get the i7-12700H processor that is 14 cores, and inside this chassis the cooling, the performance is absolutely amazing. In this video I only have time to talk about the performance, not the overall experience and the review of the laptop. Neither do I have time to talk about the different configurations and what the specs are and so on. Then I highly recommend checking out the video series about this laptop. We've got the unboxing and like what configurations are there out there, what's the pricing and so on, how to upgrade the SSD RAM, how to actually get this open, what's the inside outside like, all the specs, everything. You can find it in the description below. I'm gonna leave a playlist there where you can find all these laptop videos. The only configuration you need to know that my version over here has the i7-12700H processor, RTX 3060 mobile, and I have upgraded the RAM to 64 GB of DDR5 4800 MHz. In terms of the price for this, I'd highly recommend go check out the latest pricing in the description below, because in the UK I just saw this is like a brand new laptop and I already saw like a few £100 knocked off. So wherever you're watching this from, check out the latest pricing in the description below. So now let's talk about the performance. First of all, the CPU and GPU performance. So the CPU performance, what I want to look at is Cinebench R23, and for creators, this is actually a very good test because this is basically Cinema 4D benchmark, and this is the most synthetic load that you can give for the CPU to actually run through. This just tests the CPU the best. In terms of the multi-core performance, we're getting 19,119 points in the Cinebench R23 scores, and the single core is 1,817. So if you're wondering what do these benchmarks mean, then if we are looking at, for example, the Ryzen 5900X, then we are only a little bit lower than the Ryzen 5900X. The Intel 12600K test bench that I have here, desktop version, is actually slower by about 2,000 points, which is absolutely amazing. Now, if you remember the NUC 12 Extreme Dragon Canyon that we had over here, like the actual mini PC with a full-size RTX 3070 and an i9-12900 inside, if we're looking at the multi-core performance there, that NUC got 1,759 points there. This laptop is better than the full-size NUC. It's absolutely insane performance that you can get from this laptop. Now bear in mind, this laptop has different configuration of fan and actual performance modes. In a moment you're going to see what's the difference, but basically all the benchmarks that I'm mentioning have been done with the best performance. If you're going to knock this down from max performance to, for example, balance mode or quiet mode, you're going to be losing performance, but all of these benchmarks are plugged in and best performance in terms of what you can get out of this laptop. If we compare these results to the Asus ZenBook Pro Duo 14-inch chassis that I also reviewed, which has exactly the same processor in there, if you do the CPU benchmark test in there, then that laptop over there has 15,276 points in the multi-core score which means that this cooling for this 16-inch laptop is just so much better. It's that much better that you're gonna get about 25% more performance or something like that. So in terms of CPU performance alone, absolutely amazing. Now, when we're talking about cooling it, how good is the cooling? We look at the 10-minute throttle benchmark test here. So if you run the Cinebench R23 10 minutes back to back and seeing the average score after 10 minutes, then we can see that the score after 10 minutes would be 18,273, which would be about 4.4% slower. So you do lose a little bit of performance, or the laptop does like throttle itself down about 4.4% when just absolutely hammering it all the time. So that's going to be evident when you're doing Blender tests, or for example video exports, when the CPU is constantly loading and just hammering this. But it doesn't mean that when you're, for example, working on Photoshop or video editing, where the like kind of loads are bursts in there, like 100% and then maybe 40%, 30%, 10%, 5%, then that's not going to be the case. This is like the worst case. In the 10-minute test, you're going to lose 4% in performance. In terms of Geekbench, the single core score is 1764, which is slightly slower than the M1 Max from Apple, but at the same time, the multi-core score of this is 200 points better than the M1 Max from Apple. Bear in mind, Geekbench 5 doesn't actually count the threads per core, because we have 8 performance cores and we have 2 threads per core, but Geekbench test here doesn't actually count those, so that's that. Now you can see the Blender CPU test, the Monster, Junkshop and Classroom scenes, and if we compare this to some of the processes that I have done on the channel before, like the ZenBook Pro Duo, which is exactly the same processor, then this Legion 5i is actually measurable amount better than the Asus ZenBook Pro Duo, just because of the better cooling, be hammered much more and much faster, so the Blender score is much better. If we're looking at this test compared to like some of the desktop one, then this laptop actually beats out the desktop i5-12600K, which is absolutely ridiculous. And the Ryzen 7 5800X, it's better than the desktop versions of those CPUs. To have that in a laptop, I can't tell you how impressive that performance is. If we're looking at the GPU performance of this laptop, because it does have the mobile version of RTX 3060 inside there, then interestingly enough, according to my test bench here, I can see that I have scored better than the full-size desktop size RTX 3060. So I had the Zotac RTX 3060 amp version, the desktop size. I have a 3070 version of that plugged in there, but I had the white 3060 of that with much better, much bigger cooler, much higher power limits and everything. And according to the Blender GPU test here, I am getting slightly higher scores there, which is just very impressive. Now, being mobile GPU, but performing as good as a desktop GPU that's much better, that's really amazing. Now, before we're gonna move on to some of the applications like Adobe Suite and everything else, what I want to show you is the performance loss in different scenarios, or the different performance modes of this laptop. Now, this is very important for you to understand, because when you are choosing this laptop, you wanna know how much performance loss you're gonna get when choosing between different modes, because choosing between different modes on this laptop is very easy. With function and Q button, you have 3 options. You have the quiet mode, balance mode and max performance mode, and you can easily like swap between them without going into any of the settings, which is just amazing. So now let's have a look at how much performance you're going to be losing. If we are looking at the CPU performance, so this is basically doing Cinebench R23 with plugged in and at the max performance, and then moving on to the balance mode. Now, when we move on to the balanced option of the laptop, you can see that we're losing about 2% in the single core speeds, which is not that bad, which means that the laptop's still going to feel very snappy, and you're not, Windows are going to open exactly the same kind of thing, so the laptop doesn't feel laggy. But some of the applications that are multi-threaded, some of the creative applications, you're going to start to see quite a big of a performance drop there. For example, the multi-score, we're dropping about 40%, which is quite a lot in the balance mode. So if you do need the best performance, then I'd highly recommend keeping it on the red, which means the high performance mode, not the balance mode. And then if we compare the 10-minute throttle on the balanced mode as well, we're losing about 48%, which is still quite a lot. So basically your performance in the long term will be cut in half in the balance mode, which is quite a big of a drop. In terms of the silent score, in the single core score of the CPU, we're dropping about 8%. In the multi-core score, we're dropping about 65%, which is a lot. And then in the 10-minute throttle score, we're dropping about 67%, which is quite a lot. So this is the worst case scenario of a CPU performance drop that you're going to see between these performance modes of the laptop. Bear in mind, these are with the plugged in as well. If you're doing it on a battery, the actual max performance mode isn't available, so you can only get the balanced and the silent mode. Let's look at the performance loss also on the GPU. So if you're looking at the Blender benchmark and then seeing it on the balance modes and you know, max performance mode, because Blender is probably the worst or the most intensive test for the GPU, because the GPU is doing a lot of calculation. It's just a raw calculating performance of the GPU. When moving on to the balance mode, in Monster Scene we're dropping about 5%, Junks Up Scene we're dropping less than 1%, and in Classroom Scene we're dropping about 2.7%. So it's not that bad at all when moving on to the balance mode on the GPU side of things. In terms of the silent and quiet mode, in the Monster Scene we've dropped about 8%, in Junks Up Scene we're dropping about 5 or 4.3%, and in the Classroom Scene we're dropping about 10%. So actually in the GPU performance, if you're doing something like in GPU intensive, you're not going to see that big of a performance drop, but a big CPU performance drop, which just shows you that this is like a, you know, gaming oriented laptop, that it prioritizes the power to the GPU rather than to CPU. It drops the CPU quite a lot more than the GPU. The GPU gets kind of the same power on all of the different power modes, which is kind of good news if you're doing GPU intensive things, or, you know, like rendering, GPU rendering, something like that. I just want to underline this one last time. This is the worst case of GPU performance loss and CPU performance loss in your real world applications or softwares, whatever you're using as a creator. It would be much less than that. Now then, real world applications, Adobe Photoshop. And here, our Legion 5i Pro scored 1,274 points. That is absolutely amazing. And bear in mind, this 64 gigabytes on the laptop makes a huge difference. The scores are so high that we're performing better than the Ryzen 9 5950X test bench that has 64 gigabytes of DDR4. Okay, we have DDR4 there. We have much better cooling, much higher power limits, 16 performance cores, RTX 3090, but this laptop is better, which is just insane. We are performing better than the NUC 12 Extreme that has the 12900 in there, or the Intel 12600K with RTX 3090. We're still better there. Never mind the Ryzen 9 5900X or 5800X. This laptop in Photoshop is much better. It just makes me speechless how good this is. Moving on to Lightroom Classic, we've scored 1,206 points. And comparing it to some of the other PCs we have here, or full-size desktop PCs, where cooling isn't limited and power is much more power than this laptop, then you can see that we're still better than the 12600K, but now we're not better than the 5900X, just because Lightroom Classic, there's a massive passive score as well, which measures the multi-core performance, but then the 5900X on desktop is much better in the multi-core performance, so we're not that good, but we're still better than the 12600K and Ryzen 7 5800X on the desktop side, which is just ridiculous. Ridiculous score. Bear in mind, the 1000 score of this benchmark has been done with the i9 9900K with RTX 2080 and 64 gigabytes of DDR4. So to score over 1000 points on a laptop is very impressive. Now, video editing performance. Bear in mind the 1000 baseline score and then 100 of individual different aspects of the benchmark have been done with a Ryzen 9 5900X with an RTX 3080 desktop size GPU with 64 gigabytes of RAM. So this Legion 5i Pro scored, and the standard overall score is 1152, which is just ridiculous. Now, if you look at the individual benchmarks of this laptop, then you can see that the export score, the maybe standard export score, aren't as high as some of the PCs and aren't like as close to the 100. Even the FX and the GPU score are there, but where this laptop really shines is the actual playback speed, because the i7 12700H has the iGPU inside there, which is the Iris Xe graphics, which is very, very similar to the UHD 770 on the desktop, except it has more kind of graphics power than on the desktop side. But we have the same media engines inside, although they're not performing as good as on the desktop side of the chips. We're still getting ridiculously high playback with H.264 and H.265, where we have hardware acceleration that or Intel QuickSync on there, and we're performing about 40 or 80% better than the Ryzen 9 5900X and an RTX 3080, which to me, just to see that on a laptop, I don't know if you're speechless yet. Now, looking at After Effects, the baseline score of 1000 here has been done with 11900K desktop size with an RTX 3080 and 64 gigabytes of RAM. So the overall score is 998, so we're 0.2% slower than the 11900K with an RTX 3080 desktop size. Now, that's just insane. That's the overall score. Although the multi-core score is actually 44% better in our case here. The GPU score is a little bit lower. The RAM preview is about the same. The render score is 105, so 5% better. And then the tracking score is a little bit slower as well. So if you want to do some After Effects on this, it's absolutely doable, and you know, measurable performance here. I think this is really, really good performance for After Effects, and significantly better than the Asus ZenBook Pro Duo that had 16 gigabytes of RAM and a smaller chassis and didn't have an RTX, you know, dedicated graphics card. This laptop here is much, much better. In DaVinci Resolve, we've scored 1,188 points in the extended overall score and 1,322 points on the standard overall score. So these scores, again, the baseline 1000 score and then 100 scores on the individual kind of aspects, have been done with a 10900K and RTX Titan, the graphics card, with 64 gigabytes of RAM, which is just absolutely insane. So this is 10900K 10 core, just like 2 generations ago, desktop size with no power limits or anything like that on there. To see this laptop perform better, like 18% better in the extended overall score and about 30% better in the standard overall score, it's just absolutely amazing. Looking at the V-Ray, in terms of CPU performance on this laptop, we are better than the Ryzen 5800X, 11600K, and even better than the i9 12900 that was in the Nook Extreme Dragon Canyon, which is just ridiculous. Now, we're not quite as good as the i7 12700 desktop version because we're getting about 2,000 points less, but still absolutely amazing performance inside the laptop. And if we're looking at the GPU performance on V-Ray, first of all, the CUDA score is 912, which is better than the actual Zotac RTX 3060 amp desktop size GPU that we tested out in there, which just blows my mind. Absolutely ridiculous. So the RTX 3060 in there is fantastic. Bear in mind, it does have 6 gigabytes of VRAM rather than 12 gigabytes that we have on the desktop, but still, in terms of calculating in GPU power, it's insane performance. Now, the cherry on the cake of this laptop performance is the SSD performance. Now, wait for this. This laptop performance of the SSDs inside there is 13 gigabytes, not gigabits, gigabytes. That's 13,000 megabytes per second read speed and 10,300 megabytes per second, or 10.3 gigabytes per second write speeds. Wow. Now that's just so insane and so ridiculous. I don't know anyone who can actually utilize these speeds. Even though Gen 5 SSDs aren't out there, we're getting Gen 5 NVMe speeds here on this laptop. It's just insane. Now, even though being absolutely super fast, I recommend not getting the 1+1 configuration on the, from the factory or when you're buying this laptop. Make sure you get like just one SSD inside so you can upgrade the secondary slot, because you do have 2 Gen 4 slots in there, and these are actually running in RAID, and that's why you're getting these speeds there. You're getting 2 of the like 1 terabyte sizes, but then kind of it's run in RAID where you do get faster read and write speeds, which is ridiculous. It's really a gimmick, and I wouldn't recommend doing that. But just to show you that you have ridiculous, SSD speeds, there we go. Okay, in conclusion, is this laptop performance worth it for the creators? Now, before I'm gonna give you my conclusion, I'm gonna give you another little tip. And this laptop screen runs at 165 Hertz refresh rate. And if you do want to get a little bit more performance as a creator, because creators can't really utilize the super smooth screen, you know, it doesn't make a big difference, you don't need, you know, the frames in games, then you can turn the refresh rate down. And I did squeeze a little bit of extra performance out when we lose the refresh rate to only 60 Hertz. So just a little tip if you do need, you know, the absolute maximum performance out of your laptop. So now the performance. Do I recommend this a gaming laptop for creators in terms of the performance? I think it's really hard to beat this laptop in terms of the performance. The performance is just so good, it's so powerful that for most of the people doing creative things, this is going to be well enough. Especially if you need to go on the go and then come back home and then plug it in like a desk or deck setup where you've got bigger screens and other things going on. Honestly, this gaming laptop is the one to beat in terms of performance. The cooling, the fans, everything works is very, very solid. In terms of the price to performance, it's very hard to beat. Honestly, it's a good laptop. What can I say? Just go and buy it. It is really, 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 really good. In terms of the usability of this, there are some things that you need to know and some things that I have found. I'm gonna go in depth about the actual review of the laptop in the next video when we're talking about more in detail about like some of the keyboards and, you know, trackpads and speakers and all sorts of other things that you're using, you know, on the go, on the laptop, some things you need to know. But in terms of the performance, if you don't mind plugging other things in, accessories, maybe getting an external mouse and keyboard and just using it, you know, in your deck as well at home, like as a desktop station you have this laptop, it's amazing performance. Seriously, seriously amazing performance. If you want to pick this up, I'm going to leave the links in the description below for you to check out. Make sure you check out all the shops and which ones have the, you know, cheapest price for this, just so that you can get the best price. I want to know what you think in the comment section below. I'll meet you down there. Likes and subs, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.